Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin. This is The Digital Age. Tonight we continue our coverage of the ever-changing situation in the Middle East. President Obama has outlined his vision for Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations based on an Israeli retreat to pre-1967 borders, a statement never before made by an American president. Will these tactics succeed? Will they lead to a result? That's an open question. Also, what has become of the Twitter revolution? Is it beginning to fizzle? Or is there a hope for democratic reform that will be lasting? Here to discuss these issues with us is an expert. He is Stephen Cook. Steve Cook is an authority on the Middle East. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And his forthcoming book, The Struggle for Egypt, From Nasser to Tahrir Square, is going to be a thriller. Steve, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jim.
We're delighted to have you with us.
It's a real pleasure.
Now, the picture of the year was the King's speech, and everyone's talking about Obama's speech. I don't know whether it'll be talked about for a year or a decade or a century, but what's your impression of what he said?
It depends on which speech we're talking about. This has been the week of Middle East speeches. We've had 2 President Obama speeches and 2 Prime Minister Netanyahu speeches. But I think the big speech on Thursday, last Thursday, was the one that everybody was waiting for. This was going to be the big statement, both on the Arab Spring as well as a preview of the administration's new approach to Middle East peacemaking.
This is the one he gave at the State Department.
This is the one he gave at the State Department. I think there were some good elements to the speech on the Arab Spring. I think the most important things that he said was that the United States needs to approach the Arab Springs and the uprisings with some humility. The other thing that I think was good was that he did offer it's not enough, but symbolically economic assistance in terms of debt relief and providing for other types of economic benefits for the Egyptians and Tunisians, which I think, particularly in the Egyptian case, which Egypt is experiencing an economic crash right now, is quite important. But $1 billion of debt relief when Egypt's overall debt, both external and internal, is about $190 billion, is really a drop in the bucket. But at least symbolically, it's signaled to the international community that they should follow suit. On the Palestinian-Israeli front, this caused an uproar, his mention of the 1967 borders. And let me caution your viewers, what the president said was based on 1967 borders and land swaps. Now, it's true that no American president has ever uttered these words before, but the logical conclusion of, let's say, for example, the Clinton parameters was going to be something akin to the 1967 borders with land swaps. The Bush administration...
But mutually agreeable land swaps could mean anything, and the exception could swallow the rule.
Well, but the key there is mutually agreed upon land swaps. All that being said, I think it's essentially a non-starter. The president aroused a deep suspicion among the Israelis and the Israeli government with this statement.
Mitt Romney said he threw Israel under the bus.
He did. I think that that's probably not precisely what the president had intended, but I think that the president was trying to move the conversation forward and tee up a conversation that he's going to have tomorrow with his G8 partners. This was about laying the groundwork to prevent the Palestinians from declaring independent statehood at the UN General Assembly in September. And I think he was going further in order to bring the Europeans along to an American position in order to prevent that diplomatic train wreck that's coming. Even so, as I was saying, there was anything that Obama said that would entice the Palestinians to drop those plans for the UN General Assembly.
And there's no way we can prevent them, can we?
Not in the General Assembly.
He can. They have an overwhelming vote in the General Assembly for UN membership. Now, whether or not they're recognized, that's on a state-by-state basis. Why don't the Israelis just say, we'll recognize the Palestinians if they recognize us?
Well, that is, in fact, what happened in the 1993 Oslo Accords, but there have been, obviously, many fits and starts since then, and the Israelis are looking for something beyond the recognition that they were granted in 1993 by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu said it yesterday before Congress, that the Palestinians need to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Now, Israel, technically speaking, is not a Jewish state. There's about 1 million Palestinian inhabitants of Israel. Many of those Russian Jews who came to Israel in the early 1990s turned out not to be Jewish at all. There's a rather substantial non-Jewish population in Israel. But for the majority in Israel and for Israeli governments, it's important for the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state because it speaks to Israel's legitimacy in the region. Not just the reality of Israel in the region. I think everybody recognizes the reality in the region, but legitimacy, and that's a more permanent thing.
Don't you think at the core of this dispute is just mutual distrust? You have Netanyahu, and the Palestinians think that his real secret strategy is to open up all these settlements and eventually annex the West Bank. Well, and you have the Israelis who think this is all some kind of Arab plot to destroy Israel, sponsored by Iran. So who's right?
Well, you've just articulated everybody's positions there. From the perspective of the Palestinians, the negotiations, which have dragged on since September 1993, have done nothing but provided an opportunity for the Israelis to continue to settle in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which they consider to be occupied. We should recognize the fact that Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip, but nevertheless, the Palestinians see the negotiations as a ruse, as a way in which Israelis can keep talking while continuing to settle disputed territory.
But how does Israel negotiate with a Palestinian Authority, one component of which is Hamas, which seeks Israel's destruction?
Well, you just anticipated my second point. And for the Israelis, that the narrative that the Palestinians believe that they have time on their side in order to either outbirth, overwhelm the Israelis demographically, or take them on militarily, as Hamas would like to do, is something that is real, given that Hamas has now agreed to join Mahmoud Abbas's mainstream Fatah organization to lead the Palestinians. This is a major issue.
Let's move on to the greater Mideast. Bin Laden has disappeared. Has this changed the landscape at all?
Well, I think it's enormously symbolic that we were able to finally get Bin Laden. And I think that, as you have seen in the uprisings throughout the region, that al-Qaeda and Bin Laden's worldview is not something that the vast majority of Arabs are striving to achieve. The problem remains is that there is a very small minority that does accept this kind of cosmic struggle with the West, that even with changes in the Middle East, will still continue to take up arms against those states and the United States. So where certainly the death of Bin Laden is a blow to al-Qaeda, it remains a potent organization. And you have successors, not just Ayman Zawahiri, the Egyptian who now leads al-Qaeda. You have this American-born Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, who has a tremendous following and is charismatic in the way that Zawahiri isn't.
No shortage of Islamic extremists.
No shortage of them. They're obviously not the majority, but clearly enough people willing to take up arms.
Let's move on to Egypt, your area of great interest, I know. They now want to, when you were there last, was in February?
I was there for the beginning of the revolution,
the
first 3 days.
You were at Tahrir Square when it all got started.
Indeed, I was.
What a seat, front seat for history. But now, when you were there, Mubarak was in power. Now they want to prosecute Mubarak for murder and for bribery. So how is this going to play out?
Well, this is something that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the group of military officers who are now in charge of the country, did not want to do. They have been dragged kicking and screaming into this, but they are deathly afraid of new protests in Tahrir Square. And there were rumors that they were going to pardon Mubarak and his family in return for state assets. And this is what the Saudis have been counseling the Supreme Council to do. In response, the revolutionaries of Tahrir Square called for a second revolution for May 27th. Suddenly, yesterday, after these calls started picking up steam, the Supreme Council and the state prosecutor announced that President Mubarak would be tried for the deaths of protesters during the 18 days of the Egyptian uprising and for corruption.
Now, the dominant figure in the Supreme Council is Tantawi, the defense minister. He was an old buddy of Mubarak, so didn't he have to sign off on this?
Indeed, all of them, all the senior officers in the Supreme Council are people whose careers were made by President Mubarak. Tantawi came to the attention of Mubarak by providing security for the Mubarak family. He's not known to be a brilliant military man. Lieutenant General Sami Anen, who is the chief of staff of the armed forces, came to Mubarak's attention in 1997 for a variety of reasons. These guys are all Mubarak's men. The key issue now is that it's not about Mubarak. It's about reestablishing stability in Egypt, and for the officers salvaging what they can of the regime that protesters rose up against. They have been forced into this position out of fear that it would bring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people back out into the streets. It would have been better. It would have been better had they almost immediately established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this trial of Mubarak could encourage supporters of Mubarak to seek retribution. So it could actually further destabilize the political situation in Egypt.
Well, there are other signs of instability, aren't there? The persecution of the Copts, the Christian sect in Egypt, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, other extremists.
Jim, there is a reason why I called my book The Struggle for Egypt. This is not a situation that is going to settle down in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, or even 2 years. What's happening now after 60 years of authoritarianism, of a regime that was established by military officers in the 1950s, people are making claims on what Egypt is about and where it should be in the region and what its future trajectory is. And there's very little agreement. And that's why we're seeing the kinds of things that we're seeing. We're seeing an uptick in sectarian violence. But sectarian violence had existed in Mubarak's Egypt as well. You're seeing lawlessness because the police are in disarray. You're seeing distinct lack of, on the part of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, to think strategically about their next political steps. There is essentially a collapse of state authority. But this is not something I think to be unexpected, and I think it's something that's going to last for some time.
Now, why do we see so many of the intellectuals who led the protests, like Wael Ghonim, who was mentioned in Obama's speech, the Google executive who was arrested in Tahrir Square? He's in the United States working on a book contract. I mean, why have so many of them left the country, and why aren't they going back to rebuild the nation?
Well, Wael Ghonim is back in Egypt, and he played an extraordinary role in helping to instigate this uprising. But this was an uprising of many leaders. And just because Wael Ghonim has arrived and a number of others have come and gone does not mean that there aren't other serious people who took part in instigating the revolution, who are trying their best to organize and establish viable political parties that can compete in this coming September if those elections actually happen.
Let's move on to Libya, where we've intensified our airstrikes. Remember, we went in there to save civilian lives. Then we said we want to take out Gaddafi. I mean, do we need to send in the SEALs to take out Gaddafi? We're bombing him nonstop.
Well, this is not something that even the Libyan rebels want. They do not want Western boots on the ground. And the intensification of the air campaign against Gaddafi has really been something that the Europeans have been pushing. From everything that I understand, we are still playing a secondary role in the operation. But nevertheless, it is taking a lot longer. We've now been at this 6, 7 weeks, and Gaddafi continues to hold on. As the situation shifts, momentum in Gaddafi's favor, then in the favor of the rebellion. My sense is that this is, again, another situation that is not going to be wound up very soon, even if those airstrikes manage to get Gaddafi. But what's interesting is we went in to save civilian lives, and the president said our military objectives is different from our political objectives. Our military objective is to save civilian lives. Our political objective is for Gaddafi to go. That's the first time I ever heard something like that. I was always taught that your military goals are there to support your ultimate political objectives. And I think for President Obama, who ran against regime change in Iraq, he is essentially a partner in regime change. He just doesn't really want to talk about it.
Yes, but if you say you're going there to protect civilian lives, arguably attacking command and control, which is threatening civilian lives, is part of the mission.
Absolutely. It is absolutely part of the mission, but I think that ultimately what we're doing here is engaging in regime change by stealth. We are trying to level the playing field in a way so that the rebellion can take matters into their own hands and overwhelm Gaddafi's forces.
Let's talk about a friend we have in the Middle East.
We do? We have a friend in the Middle East?
Well, Saudi Arabia. We say they're our friends and partners. It's the oil jackpot. We have an autocratic regime there where a minority governs the country. What is our attitude towards Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's not a minority that governs the country, and our attitude towards Saudi Arabia is if there's one gas station in the neighborhood, we're going to do our best, if there's a fire there, to put it out. It was noted by many that in the president's big speech at the State Department that he did not mention Saudi Arabia. Not once did he mention Saudi Arabia. And I think the Saudis are our friends, but presently we're working at cross purposes from the Saudis in the Middle East.
Because they like autocratic regimes.
They do like autocratic regimes.
It makes it uncomfortable when they see Mubarak leave.
Exactly. And in fact, in the days before Mubarak ultimately took his flight to Sharm el-Sheikh, Saudi King Abdullah called President Mubarak and said, should you decide to crack down and American aid is withdrawn, we will make it up for you. He has been counseling the Supreme Council not to put Mubarak on trial. The Saudis have been working at cross purposes with the United States in Bahrain, where the United States had been working with Crown Prince Salman of Bahrain towards some sort of negotiated solution and change to the situation in Bahrain, where a small minority rules over a disenfranchised, economically dispossessed majority. A
small minority of Sunnis who are allied with Saudi Arabia, and a majority of Shias allied with Iran.
Well, it's not entirely clear that the Shia of Bahrain are allied with Iran. Many of them follow Ayatollahs in Iraq rather than Iran. That's one of the ironies of the Iraq wars.
But Iran said this is an extension of the Iranian Revolution.
Well, the Iranians have long had irredentist claims on Bahrain, so it's no surprise that they would try to turn this domestic issue in Bahrain into something much larger.
Greater Iran.
Greater Iran. But the point is that King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia undermined that effort to find some sort of negotiated solution, offered the King of Bahrain, the Crown Prince's father, billions of dollars in aid, offered 1,500 Saudi troops, and the Bahrainis went in and took down these protests and have been quite brutal. So the Saudis clearly are uncomfortable. They believe that any change around the region negatively affects their security interests, and they'll do everything possible to keep it outside of the kingdom.
We've got to move on to Syria. Syria is ruled by someone I think you've called the accidental autocrat, because he was supposed to be an eye doctor, Bashar al-Assad, and his brother was killed in an automobile accident, and he became the leader, and he thought, it appeared he was going to introduce reforms, but instead it's been bloody and it's been repressive. How's that going to play?
Well, I think that just being the accidental autocrat doesn't necessarily mean that you're not ruthless. And I think that Bashar al-Assad was an extension of his father's regime rather than some sort of new innovator that people made him out to be because he was Western educated and he liked to surf the internet. These were all kinds of these kind of facile arguments that people made after he came to power in 2000. Syria looks a lot more like Libya in terms of politics in some kind of interesting ways than it does to Egypt. You have
So we're going to have a no-fly zone over Syria?
Well, this is the precedent.
Airstrikes against al-Assad?
I think it's unlikely, but it's a precedent that the administration is trying to run away from, even though the precedent is clear.
No precedents in the Middle East, and a whole bunch of inconsistent positions.
A whole bunch of inconsistent positions. And I think the difference, obviously, between Libya and Syria is that we have, people have tagged the administration for saying they still believe that Assad is a reformer. I'm not sure that's the case. I think they have been also criticized for thinking that Assad would be a partner in peace. Certainly there's no evidence of either of those things. But I think what has happened in Syria, and the reason why we have been relatively softer on Assad than Gaddafi or even Mubarak, is because we have taken into account the equities of our allies there. The Turks are desperately afraid of instability in Syria. The Israelis, as much as they dislike the Assads, understand and like the predictability of that regime. It's been quiet on that border, except for Lebanon, which the Syrians, but that's kind of an understanding. The Saudis, for all of their difficulties with Syria over the course of the last decade, would not like to see instability there. And this is sort of an unholy alliance of Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and of course Iran, which has a strategic relationship with Syria, do not want to see Assad go.
You mentioned Yemen. Is Saleh ever going to leave?
I can't decide whether Gaddafi or Saleh is the Charlie Sheen of the Middle East, who's always winning. Every day there's some new announcement that Saleh is going to take a deal or not. He has not, and Yemen, if not already, is literally on the verge of civil war. That is a very dangerous situation, and you have already a state that is failing, and now you are going to have potentially all-out war there. It is quite frightening.
So we'll have replaced a thug who was tough on terrorists with some other thug who may be more friendly to them.
Well, I'm not sure how tough on terrorists he was, but
he allowed us to be tough on terrorists.
He allowed us behind the scenes to be tough on terrorists.
If you believe WikiLeaks.
If you believe, and I do believe the WikiLeaks documents. All that being said, I think Yemen really, in talking about a kind of bloody instability, that is something that is a real potential in Yemen.
So the Twitter revolution really doesn't seem to have decided very much at this moment. I mean, my scorecard comes out 6-2, 6 for the autocrats, even those hanging on, and 2 for the protesters, where the autocrats left. And it all started, it was said, with the internet. Now, what role has the internet played in all this?
Well, I'm not sure that it's fair to call it the Twitter or Facebook revolution. I think that these technologies were enabling technologies. I think they allowed people to organize. Wael Ghanim ran a Facebook called We Are All Khalid Said. He had, on the eve of the January 25th uprising in Egypt, 70,000 people had indicated on his page that they would show up for these protests, and hundreds of other thousands of people had visited that page. This was a way in which people communicate. Now, this is nothing new.
Protesters mobilized, but in Syria, Assad shut down the internet.
And in Egypt, they shut down the internet. When I was there, they shut down the internet. And what happened was people went back to the old ways of organizing, through the mosque, through the community, through word of mouth.
Cell phones.
Well, cell phone was a problem itself in Egypt when that happened. But this isn't unusual. All revolutions take advantage of some sort of new technology. Remember the Iranian Revolution? The cassette tape was critical to the Iranian Revolution. Now, in 1979, I'm not sure the cassette tape was a new technology, but nevertheless, it was a technology that was leveraged to the advantage of revolutionaries. Now, in terms of your scorecard, I think it's early. It's only May. These things started happening in December 2010.
So is it the 3rd inning, the 5th inning?
Maybe it's the 2nd inning. But what we're likely to see, given everything that has changed and the struggles, not just in Egypt, but in other parts of the region, what we're going to see is we're going to see the region shake out in new and different ways. And I think we'll see some states like Tunisia and Egypt struggling to achieve their revolutionary objectives. Maybe they'll be joined by Syria. Another group of states, Morocco, Jordan, some smaller Gulf states, basically have their heads down, trying to prevent this kind of wave of unrest from affecting them. They'll do that through tactical political reform, strategic use of money, walking around money, and a fair bit of repression. And then the repressive states, if the Assads hang on, Syria, Yemen potentially, Algeria, Libya for the moment, and Saudi Arabia at the center of this, kind of doling out the cash in order to prevent any unrest from affecting the kingdom.
Well, what a neighborhood. But let's just go back to the internet for a moment. Hillary Clinton has announced that a cornerstone of U.S. policy is the so-called freedom to connect. And she said that will be a goal of U.S. policy. Remember her statement?
Yes, I do, at Georgetown.
Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers, through any media. So that really was addressed to the internet.
I think that it is an extraordinarily important principle for the United States to stand for, given the importance of these technologies for people all over the world, and particularly for people in repressive, who are living under repressive regimes. It gives them an ability to communicate and to organize. I will say, however, that it is unfortunate that we are compromised in that stand because we have helped countries like Egypt and others acquire the technology, in fact, to shut down the internet and to interfere with these technologies.
Are you an internet utopian? I mean, do you believe the internet is going to democratize the entire Middle East?
No, I think that the internet, as I said, can be used in order for people to communicate, democratize, organize, not democratize, but it also can be used by authoritarians against these groups. The number of infiltrators in these Facebook pages, on Twitter, can be used to intimidate people. So it goes both ways. There are many good things on the internet. There's also pedophilia on the internet. So it is like anything else, it's a tool. It's the way you use it that is important.
Well, let's hope the protesters are using it for political action rather than to visit pedophilic websites.
Well, clearly the protesters in the Middle East are using it to, in the hopes of building better, more decent societies. It is the regimes that they are fighting against that are using it in ways to undermine these efforts.
And Assad has organized an electronic army to deal with it. But I have a question for you, Steve Cook.
Yes, sir.
Is the Twitter revolution beginning to fizzle?
I think that, one, we shouldn't call it the Twitter revolution, and two, it's early yet in these revolutions, and I'm not even sure we can call them revolutions yet.
Steve Cook, thank you so much for coming by.
My pleasure.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. For the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.